Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're back.
We're back. All right, we're back. So over the next hour, I'll be asking Lizzie and Dathan questions that were pre-submitted first, and then we'll go get to some live questions near the end. We hope sharing their experience will help you feel more confident as you go into those first interviews. Lizzie and Dathan, can you guys tell us a little bit more about yourself? Maybe you want to start, Lizzie?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a full stack engineer on the careers team here, which means that I help to build actually a lot of the products that our students use in their job hunts. Actually, one of the very first products that I built here at Udacity when I was brought on as a contractor last year was a lot of the UI for the career portal. So that's a product that's like very near and dear to my heart. And the careers products and team in general are near and dear to me because I'm also a career changer. So yeah, it's exciting to kind of get to share my experience a little bit with people who are going through the same thing now that I went through, you know, a year and a half ago.
All right. Dathan, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Dathan. I have been with Udacity for about 3 years. First as what we call an individual contributor on the payments engineering team, which I helped found. And since then, I've recently moved into an engineering manager position on the same team, grown the team a little bit, which is awesome. So I'm like I was interested in participating, you know, like in this whole interviewing thing, because in my last gig prior to coming to Udacity, I did a whole lot of interviewing. I'm a little over 700 lifetime interviews now.
Whoa!
And so like that's a lot of time invested, and I'm hoping I can, you know, in some way like help people who are trying to get a job in technology, you know, get through that process, because I know it can be a little daunting, you know, when you're starting out.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Lizzie and Dathan. So let's get to those questions. We'll start with the pre-submitted questions. And the first one we have is, how relevant are technical interview questions to day-to-day work? Who wants to start with that one?
You had a pretty good response.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, you know, technical interviewing is like a controversial subject, right? And it's not about like whether we should interview candidates, because of course, like we interview candidates. It's about, yeah, people see interview questions, technical interview questions, as like contrived, right? Like, yeah, when am I ever going to need to validate that a crossword puzzle is fully connected in my day-to-day job? And of course, like, you won't, right? And so the questions are, interview questions, while they often are contrived, I think, like, I've realized in retrospect that that they're relevant, A, because they help you, you know, they do evaluate you on some algorithmic knowledge, which is always good to have, and also because like what they test on really is, given that you have like some toolbox like of skills and knowledge, can you apply that to solve some problem that you've never encountered before, right? And and that is what we do on a day-to-day basis, right? Like as a software developer, like your job is basically composing little bits of abstractions together to solve problems. And so while the problems may be a little contrived and the questions you get asked, those algorithmic interview questions, they may be a little contrived. The questions themselves, even those are relevant to your job because they're evaluating something that really is the essence of what we do. And then the other two, like, I think are less controversial. The other kinds of interview questions that we see are ones that are called decomposition, which are basically system design questions. And I don't think anybody challenges the relevancy of those, right? It's like, we design systems. You just asked to do it sort of in a real-time setting. So yeah, like I would say that they're relevant, even though sometimes it can be hard to see because you sort of miss the forest for the trees because you're focused on like the problem as it's stated rather than what it's trying to evaluate.
It's more about the process than the content in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the specifics of the question, solving, for instance, validating the crossword puzzle is fully connected is probably not relevant, certainly not to me, doing payments processing and transaction processing on a day-to-day basis. But being able to look at a problem and say, oh, well, in order to get to the solution, I have to do this, right? That sort of mental process is what we do, and so I think that they're they're actually pretty relevant in terms of the skills that they evaluate.
Yeah,
that's comforting.
We're doing something right.
So the next group of questions we have are all about preparing for the interview, and the first one is, how do you recommend preparing for the interview? What qualities or skills do you look for in your ideal software engineering candidate, and how are these skills best exhibited?
So I can speak to the preparation side of things a little bit, and mainly my advice is just practice doing interview problems. And part of like going through the interviewing process, like going to so many technical interviews, is practicing that. You're literally practicing while you're at the interview. You're like preparing for the next interview. And like I used to have, when I was doing this, like I have a big window in my house that I used to use as a whiteboard, and I put a stack of markers next to it, and like every day I would just go through and like pick a random problem off of LeetCode or from cracking the coding interview and just solve it on the window and like treat it like an interview. So I would be there, like I would set a timer for myself, and I would literally go through and be writing code and speaking out loud to nobody, like as I was doing it, pretending that I was like explaining my code and explaining my thought process to somebody else that was in the room. And it really just kind of got me comfortable, like speaking about my code and about my process, which I think is what a lot of hiring managers are looking for in part. And then just like picking problems that are challenging for you to practice. Like pick something that you don't think you can do and just try to do it and get as far as you can with it. And if you get stuck, like maybe ask someone for help or take a look at the hint in the back of the book. Like then work as far as you can again until you're stuck again, and then get yourself unstuck and just kind of keep doing this until you get to the solution and you've fully understood that solution. That was kind of like most of my process for preparing for interviews in that way. Awesome.
And so on the side of like what do we look for in candidates, and this is something that I think that a lot of people who are going through technical interviews like don't quite get, is that they're very focused on solving this problem and getting the right answer, right? And that's only part of the story, right? So as an interviewer or as a hiring manager, like ultimately we're trying to answer the question of, do I want this person on my team? There's a lot more to that than can they solve arbitrary interview question X, right? There's like, do they have a problem solving process, right? Because candidates a lot of times are focused on like specific problems, and no matter how much you practice, you're never going to see every problem that you might get asked in an interview, right? So it's all about building that process to approach problems that are novel to you. And of course, modern software development is all about teamwork, right? And so communication is a huge part of what we're looking for too. And it's much more than just solving the problem.
Cool. Let's see, what's our next question? What are the expectations for the interview candidate? What should I know off the top of my head? And what should I most focus on becoming proficient at? and this person is coming from a different industry, so they feel very like they're in unfamiliar territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt that way. I still kind of feel that way a little bit. But yeah, I mean, expectations definitely vary. There's no standard for in my experience. And it also depends on like your experience level. So when you're going into an interview, like the interviewer is going to know if you are a junior level candidate or if you're a senior level candidate, and they're going to adjust their expectations accordingly, I imagine. And I mean, in my experience, the expectation was really just that you would have a process, that you would be able to ask good, like clarifying questions about the prompt, like not just diving in head first and just trying to like write code on the board, but thinking like, okay, what are the possible edge cases? Like, what is the actual problem I'm trying to solve? Like, how can I get there? And talking it through with the interviewer and being able to communicate like what you're thinking as you're working through the problem. I feel like that was more the expectation, more so than like, okay, this person can write this, function in under 2 minutes. And then as far as like things you should know off the top of your head, like, I mean, it depends on the industry that you're going into, but like as a front-end developer, it was very much like you should know how a REST API works. You should know some fundamentals about how the internet works. You should know some data structures and algorithms and stuff like that. And I'm sure like that will vary depending on what position you're interviewing for.
Yeah, and I think important sort of to that is like you didn't mention any language specific anything there, right? And I think that's important to note is like there are some job postings, there are some positions that have specific language requirements. You must know Java and the Spring Framework. You must know Python and Django, stuff like that. And that'll all be on the job post, right? So like it should be transparent to you whether that's required or not. But for a lot of positions, what they're looking for is sort of general knowledge of the domain, so that when presented with a problem, like you have that sort of fundamental skill set so you can approach it.
Yeah.
And so it's like the generalized stuff. REST API is how MVC architecture, maybe how the browser actually communicates with the server and what the differences are between the two. Across a lot of languages are much more important to know than like boning up on a specific language.
Yeah, I had that question in another webinar actually, was like, how many languages do I have to know? And I was like, don't have to know any particular languages or any number of languages to be hired. You need to know, more importantly, like sort of what you're doing with those languages. Like, what is it that you're trying to do, and why do we use this language for this thing and this language for this other thing, if that's how we use them, as opposed to like knowing a lot of languages.
Right. I think it is worth spending a minute talking about the importance of reading the job description so to get as much information, so students can get as much information as they can about what the interviewer might be looking for. Can you guys speak to that at all?
Yes, do that. Read the job description for sure. I mean, be as prepared as you can. But then there's also, I mean, I think we might be touching on this later. You don't necessarily have to meet all the requirements exactly of the job description in order to apply. Like, you should know what you're applying for, and you should know what the job is. But if you meet, say, I don't know, 75, 80% of the requirements, like, apply, and you'll probably do fairly well.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, the job description is there. It's rarely there. There are some exceptions, government positions, et cetera, where like what's on there is a strict requirement that HR imposes. But for the most part, like the job description is sort of their ideal candidate. And then the interview is a process by which they decide, do we actually want you to join the team? And so the job description is sort of it's like normative, but it's not strictly, like, it's not a checklist, a strict set of requirements in most cases. But at the same time, it is there to communicate, what the expectations are. And so if you just don't meet any of the checkboxes on a job description, you should probably either reconsider applying for that job or do some study and some practice before applying for that job. Just because it's not likely to be a good use of your time. The odds of you landing that particular job are going to be low. So yeah.
Cool. Let's see what we have next here. How do you know when you're ready to apply for certain kinds of jobs? I think this is similar.
Yeah,
I kind of already answered this, but we can maybe put a spin on it. If the job requires knowledge of JavaScript and you know some JavaScript, how do you know if that's enough?
I mean, you're never going to know for sure, right? But it's sort of like we were just saying. Yeah, I mean, if you meet most of the requirements, like give it a shot. And I think you had something like to make a list of jobs that you wanted in order of like how you wanted them. I thought that was
my, like, I don't know if this is the best practice or not, but I've like coached people before on, if you're like nervous about interviewing, make a list of all the places you're going to apply and then rank them in the order you'd like to, like how badly you want to work there, and then apply starting from the bottom of the list. Right? So like you're gonna be less anxious about the interview if the consequence of not acing the interview is like you end up not working in a place that you didn't really want to work anyway, and it's fantastic practice that way. And I think you may find that you land a good job in process partly because like nerves are a killer during interviews, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not, if you can like do whatever you can to eliminate those nerves, that anxiety, you're actually doing yourself a big favor. And so either while you're working your way up the list, you're going to be less anxious because you didn't care about this job that much, and maybe you'll do better than you otherwise would have. Or by the time you get up to the companies where you really want to work, you've had enough practice that you're less anxious than you would have been if you'd gone there first. So like I don't know if that's a best practice, but and I wouldn't make your list too long. I mean, who has that kind of time, right? Interviewing is time consuming, but yeah, like I've had people tell me that's a successful approach before.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's funny. I actually, after I got hired full time at Udacity, I had one more interview for another job, and I went into that interview knowing that I'd already gotten the job at Udacity, and it was a job that I did not think I would get. It was like at a company that was doing stuff with Bitcoin, and I was like, about Bitcoin. But I went into the interview and I basically was just like, yeah, I'm great. And I was like so confident because I already had the job at Udacity and they offered me a job as well.
On the spot.
It was like, later that day, they basically called me and were like, yeah, we really liked you. And I was like, great, now I have 2 jobs because I was like so confident going into that second interview. So yeah, nerves is,
Yeah, totally.
There was a question in here that spoke to what to do when you get nervous. I want to find that one. Okay, here we go. Sometimes I become anxious if I've forgotten something or if I've made a glaring mistake. How does one recover after freezing up in a tech interview? How do I show an interview that it's not my understanding or knowledge, but it's just my nerves?
So as a hiring manager, what I want to see, this is sort of getting back to it's not about solving the problem so much, right? Solving the problem is just one facet of what we're looking for. We're trying to figure out if you're somebody that I want to work with. And so if I'm like a person that I'm working with, I want them to, if they've made some glaring mistake, to be able to own up to it, right? Like you want to work with people who are honest and have integrity, and B, be able to discuss if it's a bad mistake. I want them to be able to explain to me why it was wrong. Right? I want them to understand, even if in an interview context I have to point out why it was wrong. I want them to then be able to understand why it was wrong, and then ideally we can arrive at the right solution, and they can explain to me why it's a better solution than the original mistake was. And if you can do that, then the fact that you made a mistake in the first place doesn't bother me as much.
It's really more like an opportunity to show a different kind of communication.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it. And I also, to add to that, I would say it's okay to say I'm nervous. I have said it in interviews. I think that people go into interviews and they kind of forget that the person interviewing them is also a human being. And it seems like you are a great interviewer because you're very much aware of the humanity of the situation, and you've been through this yourself before, so you kind of understand what the person's going through. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that. It's okay to say I'm nervous. Sorry, I think I made a mistake. You don't have to be a perfect robot in an interview.
Yeah, a lot of interviewers actually put a lot of energy into trying to keep you from getting nervous, right?
Yeah. And if they're good, if it's a good interviewer and it's a good company and the person treats you well in the interview, then you know that you want to work there. And if they don't, then maybe that's a clue to you to rethink about if you really want to work with that person.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's really important, that like a lot of candidates go into these interviews not really internalizing the fact that interviews are a two-way street. You know, like you're interviewing at this company, they're trying to figure out if they want to hire you. You also need to be like discovering if you actually want to work there, right? And the interview is like, has a ton of signal for you to try to figure that out. And also I think to me, there's, it's a little like confidence inspiring to know that I have some power in this too. Like, even like it's not just up to them. Even if they give me an offer, it's up to me to like to accept that offer, right? Like we both have some power in this relationship, and I think internalizing that is like good for your confidence and really good for helping nerves like, in the situation.
Yeah, it can be hard for sure because like especially early on in the interviewing process, you're so nervous and also like you need a job, right? You're like at the end of the day, you're like, well, I do need a job, so it's hard to kind of to keep that in your mind. But it's also good to remember that like just taking the first job that comes along or the first thing you're offered because you're so relieved isn't necessarily going to work out like long term. And it's better to figure that out early on than to like maybe 6 months to a year from now it doesn't work out and then you have to go through this whole process again. Like that would be so much worse.
Yeah. That's a really good thing to keep in mind.
Some hiring managers will tell you that like that they expect candidates to have like at least 5 questions to ask, you know, the interviewer, the hiring manager, and I don't. But what I do think is like as a candidate, regardless of whether the interviewer is going to like give you credit for having good questions or ding you for not having questions, like you owe it to yourself to have some questions, like to figure out what's important to you in a job and to be prepared to ask your interviewers those things, right? To figure out whether like this is a good fit for you.
And I think we have some suggestions for those kinds of questions in our career resources. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what to do during the interview. A couple people asked, what should we do if we don't know the answer to a question? How should we remain confident?
I can talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think I've sort of already covered it, but I think like, first of all, don't just assume that you don't know the answer. Like sometimes you freeze up in an interview and all you really need to do to kind of get yourself unstuck is to just start like working, start writing, start working on the problem. So if that's like drawing yourself a diagram or trying to write out some pseudocode or just talking through the problem out loud, like, okay, what are the inputs? What are the expected outputs? Really just trying to break it down in a way that's not just in your own head. That can be really helpful for getting unstuck before you just totally freak out and think, oh my God, I don't know the answer.
We actually do this like professionally too, right? Like rubber.
Right. Yeah.
It's where you can actually like work your way through a problem. I prefer to do it with coworkers, but you can actually do this by just having like a stuffed animal or a figurine or something that you explain what you're. That you explain what you're working on in enough detail to try to like get them to understand it. And frequently you'll come up with the answer. And we do this all the time, like in the course of actually working as a professional developer too. So I mean, it works great in the interview too.
Yeah. And then I mean, I definitely like if you really are at the very limit of your knowledge and you just don't know. I mean, I think honesty is the best policy, like you said, and I think that it should be like a conversation between you and the interviewer, and like talking it through together is a big part of the job, like you're saying, and definitely something that I think is valuable to do in an interview.
And I would absolutely agree with that. And further, I would say that a lot of candidates think that like they should know the answer to everything going into an interview, right?
Right.
And like I already said, there's no way you're going to know the answer ahead of time to every interview question you might be asked. In fact, if you did, like if we get a lot of candidates that already know how to solve some problem that we're asking, that's a sign to us that it's time to retire that question. Right? Because if somebody just knows the answer, they can just rattle it off. And then all those other things that we actually want to evaluate, like communication, problem solving ability, right? That question is now terrible for those things. So it's not about like not knowing the answer to something coming in the door shouldn't be a sense of anxiety, right? That should be the expectation. Like, because it's all about trying to see how you can approach a problem that is new to you, right? And so the ideal interview question will be one that you don't already know, and that should be the standard.
Yeah, and to remember also that like nobody knows everything. Even the person that's interviewing you, there's stuff that they don't know.
I've had a lot of candidates teach me stuff in interviews.
Yeah. Definitely true.
Cool. So if you've restated, you can always restate the problem even if you don't know where to start. If the next step is to ask your interviewer questions about the problem, if you don't know how to solve it, what kind of questions should you ask?
I mean, I guess it's hard to do without like a specific problem to think of questions for, but just things that help you to sort of narrow down what it is you're trying to do. Like clarifying questions and questions about like potential edge cases. Like, is this going to be used on like a very large scale, or like, am I going to need to return an object from this function? Like, what is the shape of the input? Like, just like narrowing down basically what is sometimes a very broad question. Like sometimes I think interview questions can sound sort of vague, like when you first hear them, and it's kind of on you to sort of get to that point of knowing like exactly what it is we're trying to solve.
And some interviewers actually design questions specifically so that they're underspecified to begin with, because they want to see, frequently, like as product engineers, when we get, tasks or we're trying to build some feature into a product, it's up to us to figure out, what the actual like specifications for that feature are. And so some interviewers will design questions that are intentionally underspecified in order to get candidates to do that sort of thing. Like, oh, well, what should I do if the input is null, if the input is 1? Can I always assume that, like, if we're looking for some pattern in the input, can I assume that there is going to be an instance of that pattern in the input, right? And so these sorts of questions, like, I like when I'm looking at something as a candidate or somebody trying to solve a problem, I always just look at, as Lizzie said, the shape of the input, right? And just look for all the edge cases there. How big can it be? How small can it be? Like, is there unexpected stuff around it? And you should definitely like be prepared to do that, because you'll probably encounter some interviewers that will ask you questions that are intentionally vague because they want you to do that. And so it's both a skill that you need to have anyway, and an excellent way to like get unstuck on a problem.
Yeah. So if you freeze, just think to yourself, okay, input. What can I ask about input?
Yeah, I think can I assume that is like one of the most helpful questions that you can ask.
Yeah.
And most of the time I'll say yes. Because like if you stated your assumptions, then that's fine. We can work within that. And also as an interviewer, it gives me the chance later to say, okay, remember that assumption we made? Now that we have a solution under that assumption, what if we invalidate that assumption? What if we decide that actually, no, this, there doesn't necessarily need to be an instance of that pattern in the input. Can you take the code that you've written and update it to fit that case? Which is an easier thing than doing it from scratch. And so I really like letting the candidates set some really tight assumptions, and then we'll build out from there, like really nicely scoped solution to a nicely scoped problem, and then we'll expand it incrementally. Which is also one of the reasons I like doing that, is it's a better representation of what we do professionally too, right? Like we never build the full product to begin with. We build a couple features, and we add on a feature, and we add on a feature, and we add on a feature. And then we deal with users that logged in through OAuth instead of username and password. And okay, cool, now we'll handle those users. And it's a lot easier than trying to build the whole thing and keep it in your mind from scratch.
Yeah,
absolutely. Let's see. As an interviewer, if an applicant stands at the whiteboard for a long time without saying anything or writing anything out, how do you respond?
Yeah, so I'm just going to be totally honest. Like standing at the whiteboard for a long time without saying anything or without writing anything is a bad sign, right?
Yeah.
So that's something like you should try to avoid ever getting into that position, just by talking, right? Just by during the interview, every thought that you have, as long as they're work appropriate thoughts, should like not remain in your head, right? They should come out so you can have a conversation about it. And so try to avoid getting into that position in the first place. But assuming that it happens, I just assume that's kind of nerves. And so as an interviewer, I'll just start asking questions, right? My first question is, what are you thinking? Because their mind might be going, it might not be that they are drawing a blank. Their mind might be going a mile a minute, and it's just not coming out in any observable way, right? So I just ask them, I'm like, what are you thinking right now? And that's my usual initial. And if we don't make good progress by just discussing their thought process, then I just start asking leading questions. I'm like, okay, yeah, I agree with whatever they've said. What about, and maybe I'll ask them like something about input, right? And so it's a failure mode for like in any interview, I want to come out with a strong opinion about the candidate, right? Either yes, I want them on my team, or no, I don't want them on my team. And if you just stand at the whiteboard, I don't actually know, because I haven't gotten signal. All I've gotten signal is that you have nerves, right?
Yeah.
And you froze. And so I want to avoid that just as badly as the candidate does, because I hate coming out of an interview and like not having a strong opinion that I can justify. Because if I, as a hiring manager, if an interviewer comes to me and they say, well, they just sort of stood at the whiteboard, then I'm like, that's not enough for me to go on, right? Like, what did you do to try to drive that interview? And so, yeah, I just start asking leading questions. But you as a candidate should try to avoid getting into that position at all. And mostly you do that just by talking. Whatever you're thinking, just say it out loud.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Will I have to produce code on the spot? How will I be tested for knowledge beyond what my portfolio shows?
I mean, yes, you will have to produce code on the spot. But I think, and we've kind of touched on this, it's not as scary as it sounds once you take into consideration the fact that it's more of a conversation between you and the interviewer than a test. And you should kind of go into it thinking that it's more like a pair programming session or like a debugging session than like you being examined for your knowledge. Yeah, I think keeping that in mind makes that aspect of it a lot less scary, for me at least.
And I would, yeah, I totally agree. And I would further add that like most of the code, like when we do whiteboard interviews, most of the solution to these problems end up being 10, 15 lines of code, and you have 45 minutes, right, to come up with this, right? So it's really about like working through the problem. The actual task of writing out code, there isn't that much code that actually gets written during whiteboard. So like try not to stress that too much.
Yeah, you're gonna try and come up with a problem that takes very few lines of code to solve, right?
Exactly. I mean, because we want the case of the person who writes really large and very legibly but takes up a lot of real estate. We still want them to be able to get their entire solution on a whiteboard.
Yeah.
So like we're not looking for problems that require you to just start writing and not stop for 45 minutes, because that isn't really that good for anybody. Like I said, we want to have a discussion about the code, right? And about your thought process and about, well, what about this case? And if there's a problem that requires you to write that much code, we have no time for discussion. Yeah. So these problems are not usually that big.
That actually reminds me that it's actually good to practice just the physical procedure of writing code on the whiteboard if you're going to have to do that in interviews, because it took me a while to actually like be able to do that. It's you get so used to sort of the mechanics of typing it, and that becomes sort of your process. But then to take that process and put it up on a board where you're physically writing can feel a little strange. So it's definitely worth practicing just for that, just to get like, how are you going to write your code on the board? How are you going to make it fit on the board and make it legible? I think it's actually kind of important. Something that not everyone thinks about probably.
And make it like, have it laid out so that the structure still like kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and I would say that I get into interviews sometimes where the candidate writes out some code and then a piece of it needs to be changed. And they take everything below that and they erase it and rewrite everything from there down to the bottom. And don't do that, right? Because the interview really isn't about like getting a perfect piece of code on the board, right? I would much rather you draw an arrow to where the new code goes, write some new code, right? And then we've saved however much time it took you to, like all that time you spent rewriting the rest of it is just wasted, right? And practice that too, right? Like it's really, the code is just a discussion piece. Right, and the discussion, it's just as valid a discussion piece with arrows and marks through and some pieces erased and like things written at an angle as it is if it's picture perfect.
Yeah. Cool. All right, I think that's all of our pre-submitted questions. Let's go to some live questions. All right, here's one. How do I go from learning, studying through Udacity to technical interviews if I've never had a job in the field?
So how do I go from learning and studying through Udacity course to technical interviews if I've never had a job in the field? I mean, the same way people who have had jobs in the field do it, right? Like we look on, we check our professional network to see if anybody that we know has openings at their company, check job boards, etc. Right? And so like, yeah, I mean, there's sort of a process. Like if you have had a job in the field for a long time, you probably have a bigger professional network in the field, and it can maybe be a little bit easier to find open jobs that are a good fit for you. But it doesn't necessarily help you pass the interview, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of, like last time I went looking for a job, I was on Stack Overflow jobs and Monster and Dice and Angel List and all these other places that list tech jobs, which is exactly what I would have done if I didn't already have experience in the field too.
Yeah, and I also would add that just getting some work experience in the field is valuable. Like when I first started, I actually found my first job, which was kind of a freelance job, through some friends in the music scene that I was a part of. And I ended up doing like some part-time work and just getting some experience that way, as opposed to trying to go directly from like having never worked in this industry to like a full-time, full-stack job at Udacity. I went through the process of like doing a few other jobs, like part-time jobs and some freelancing jobs, just to get the experience and to have something on my resume and to really feel like what it's like to work on the team and work in this industry.
Yeah, there's sort of lots of different entry level jobs that are more like contract positions or internships or this isn't a job, but working on open source projects, you can get lots of good experience. Yeah. Let's see. If we have an interview like tomorrow, what are some resources for brushing up in obviously a very short period of time?
Oh no, someone has an interview like tomorrow.
Well, good job getting the interview.
That's great. That's great.
Congratulations.
Like if you have an interview tomorrow, there are actually some, and I don't have links handy because I don't have a computer in front of me. There are at least 3 Udacity courses that we have. There's a front-end interviewing, I think there's a back-end interviewing, and there's a algorithms and data structures in Python course that would be great to review. And I don't know if you can do it in that amount of time, but scheduling a mock interview just to get the nerves out. If you know somebody in the field who's done interviews before, maybe you can buy them dinner or something and impose on them, and I don't know if you can schedule it through Pramp that fast. But Pramp is a sort of peer interviewing service. It is Pramp, right?
Yep.
Yep. That Udacity is partnered with in the past.
And if
to do that.
Pretty sure that if you're a nano degree student, we still have a partnership with Pramp, so you get a certain number of free mock interviews.
Great. And so, like I said, I don't know what the scheduling delay is for those. So tomorrow may be ambitious, but I think the most important thing would just be not trying to layer on too much, right? Review. Don't try to cram. Just review. Make sure everything's fresh in your head, and maybe do an interview to try to get the nerves out.
Yeah, and I mean, with a mock interview, you could also just reach out to someone who's in your cohort or another student and schedule some time, like on a Google Hangout with them, and have them give you a mock interview. That would probably be pretty useful.
Cool. Similar question. What can you do hours before an interview to mentally prepare yourself?
Eat a banana. Those are apparently really good for like nerves. That's actually just, I don't know if that's actually true, but it's an old like wives' tale type thing from like my days of music. Like before you go on stage, eat a banana. The potassium calms your nerves. I don't know. That's what I was doing.
Couldn't be a bad thing, right?
Yeah, for sure. Bananas are very healthy.
I would try not to stress it too much, right? Like I would actually focus on what are the questions that you want to ask them. Like if it's just a few hours before the interview, I would focus, on like, what do you need to learn about the company to figure out if you want to work there? Because other than a light review, maybe of like a list of algorithms, data structures that you already know, I'm going to try to cram anything.
Yeah.
Maybe a light review, but otherwise I would focus on like what you want to get out of the interview. To me, there's like a sense of empowerment that comes with that, and the best thing you can do immediately before an interview is to work on your nerves, not work on your knowledge base.
Yeah, because you're not going to be able to learn anything new or help yourself really in that way hours before an interview.
Yeah, there's sort of an infinite number of questions they could ask you, but there's sort of a finite amount of information that you can know about their company.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And also, like your brain is, I mean, it's not technically a muscle, but it sort of works like a muscle, right? And it gets tired. And you don't want to like mentally exhaust yourself going up to what's probably a series of people asking you mentally exhausting things.
Yeah. Let's see. Can you discuss some etiquette for online or remote interviews? Camera angles, platforms we may want to experience before needing to use it live?
Yeah,
especially the live coding platforms.
Yeah, Udacity does, or I mean, they did for.
We make it an option for pretty much everybody to do.
Are we back? I think we're back.
I think we're back.
Okay.
Sorry so much. That's really ironic saying that you need good signal and then we dropped.
Yeah, we'd like to be able to say that was a demo.
Right. Yeah. How frustrating it is. So yeah, to recap, have really good signal and low background noise. And if you have it available, something like wired headset, noise canceling headphones. Something to like a dedicated mic that's not your computer's mic just works as a better experience for everybody. And that's really the main thing is like so much of the interview is conversation. You wanna really maximize your ability to do conversation. Maybe this is just me. I don't even care that much about the camera angle. I've interviewed folks, where the camera was to the side or to the front or almost looking up their nose. It doesn't matter that much to me. But in an interview, you want to put your best foot forward. So picking a good, flattering. It was an error loading your app.
I think it's still going now.
Okay, cool. So picking a good camera angle isn't going to hurt anything. That's for sure. But to me, it's less important than the audio.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, I always just made sure I was like wearing a nice shirt and have like a blank neutral wall behind me. It's not super important, but I think it's good to look somewhat professional. Like you're not just like hanging out on your couch in your PJs, It's always good.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Even in a place like Udacity, where where the dress code. I mean, I'm wearing a hoodie and I have a T-shirt under it. Like, our dress code here is very casual. Casual is probably fine. Slovenly is definitely not.
Yeah,
right.
So.
Yeah.
You want to go one dress code level up from what you're going to wear at your job, right?
Exactly.
Let's see. I had one more thing to add to that. I can't remember what it was though. Let's see. Kelsey, do we have any more
There's one at the bottom.
real-time questions? Is it a red flag if someone doesn't know the correct term for something?
It depends on the something.
Yeah.
And it's really specific to the job. If I'm a back-end systems engineer and I don't know the difference between a process and a thread, and I'm claiming like some experience at doing this, that's probably a bad sign. But it also might be, just a slip of the tongue, right?
Right.
So if it's important, like if the distinction is important and knowing that term is important, I think it's incumbent on me as an interviewer to clarify, like, was that just a slip of the tongue, or is there actually a knowledge gap there? So like I wouldn't worry too much about like not remembering the right term for something, as long as if they point out the right term, like you're able to talk about it, because nerves play havoc with your brain during an interview. I mean, I've forgotten, I've forgotten all sorts of terms during interviews, and it hasn't generally been a problem. Yeah.
Sounds like another case in which owning up to it would be pretty important, right?
Absolutely.
Let's see. Do you have any additional resources you can share to prepare for the technical interviews? Yes! The Career Resource Center has tons of resources, including the courses that Dathan mentioned. We have several courses for different nano degrees and for different fields, and then we have our data structures and algorithms courses, which are applicable to just about any interview, any technical interview. And we will include links to those in the YouTube description. Let's see. Do we have time for a couple more questions, or should I? Yeah, that's all we've got time for. So I want to wrap up by thanking Lizzie and Dathan so much for taking the time and giving us some awesome answers, and thank everyone for who was able to attend. We've got tons more events going on in Career Month, and we have another webinar at 4 p.m., which is more going to focus on the soft skills of the interview, the behavioral questions. Like I said, we have tons of resources that the careers team at Udacity has put together, which we will include in the YouTube description. Especially if you're a career change, you should definitely check out Matt's webinar on preparing for the behavioral portion of your interview. 4 p.m. And that's a wrap.
All right.